deep down in you, you know what it takes to be awesome at that thing, but you're not allowing yourself to do it because maybe you're afraid of the work it'll take or any of these things. But that's the ultimate power that shadow work has, right? Is not only to reveal where you might be holding yourself up in a negative way, but also the things you might be doing, the stories, the belief systems, etc., that you might be holding yourself up from experiencing the greatest highs in your life completely naturally with no substances added.
Welcome to the Embrace and Expand podcast, where we talk about everything from spirituality, self-development, relationships, mindfulness, wellness, and everything that will help you embrace all that you are so you can expand into the best version of yourself. All right, and welcome back to another episode of the Embrace and Expand podcast. So today we have a special guest who is a man after my own heart. He is a highly optimized individual who has found balance between the mind, body, and spirit. An industry leader in cannabis education, helping people to overcome abuse, overuse, and codependency. He teaches people how to consciously connect with cannabis, set intentions, and experience the power of the flower. So this is a conversation I've been looking forward to having for some time now, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Ryan Sprague. Ryan, welcome to the Embrace and Expand podcast.
Adam, thanks so much for having me, man. Thank you so much for the intro. You know, it's like, I joke about this a lot with other podcasters. The intros are the most fun part because it's where we get to like pump the guests up. And like, my goal is always like, you know, and it happened when I listen to yours too. It's like, man, it's so cool to see how people receive you, you know, and I think that's one of like the superpowers that I know for me, I didn't tap into nearly enough until I was around individuals that would reflect those things. And how do we know who we are, how we operate, what's valuable that we do if we don't have other people affirm us? Because a lot of times, like, we're just us, right? Like, we're just like, oh no, everyone's like this, right? And so it's always amazing to hear how people craft the intros, and you did an amazing job, man. I'm super stoked to be here.
Well, I know cannabis has been a big topic with my podcast ever since season 1, and you are an absolute wealth of knowledge. You know, we chatted a little bit before this podcast got started, and we are very much in alignment with our philosophy in how it should be used, how it should be cultivated, and in what way that people should actually interact with it. So for those of the listeners that aren't familiar with you, why don't you just go ahead and take a little bit of time to tell us about yourself and tell us about your path?
Yeah, great question. And, you know, I love going over this story because I think for a lot of people, they're probably like, all right, cool, but why cannabis? Like, how the hell did you get into cannabis like this? And, you know, it's a appropriate question, right? Because especially with the psychedelic renaissance blooming and all of these things, I think a lot of people will be like, why did you just choose to focus on cannabis? And it wasn't really a choice that I made logically. It was something that after many years, which I'll get into in a second, it kind of dawned on me, you know? And so I'll get into like how this all started. So when I was 16, I started experiencing generalized anxiety disorder. That's essentially what they called it. And I went to my doctor, who met with me for all of like 5 or 10 minutes and told me that I then had anxiety. Not that I was experiencing it, but I had it, right? So as a 16-year-old, you know, of course, I didn't know the things I know now. I didn't understand that we all experience these things in different ways, shapes, or forms, and that diagnoses can be very challenging because it puts you inside of this box. And so I went with his recommendation, which was to get on, I believe at that point it was Paxil was the first medicine he put me on. And every one of these medicines I tried just made me feel more disconnected from myself. Like, you know, it like, again, the language at that point was probably different, but looking back in hindsight, that's how I would state it. And so every time he would give me another medication, I would go home, I would try it out over the next week, and it wouldn't work the way that I thought it would work. I started losing a little bit more and more hope. And so this was like a very disempowering time in my life where I was, you know, forced to ask myself, like, is this just the way the rest of my life is going to be? And of course, at that point at 16, you don't really understand that, like, this is all part of the challenge of life. But, you know, at that point, it was very damaging to like my psyche and just my overall mental health. And so at a similar time, I was talking to a friend about this, and he was like, well, dude, have you ever tried using cannabis for that? And, you know, again, probably said weed, probably, right? But, you know, like, at that point, I had just been saying no, you know, the Nancy Reagan approach. You know, I had seen some friends that fell into that classic lazy stoner stereotype, and I had wrongfully associated it with cannabis causing that. Not that these people were already lazy and now they were just lazy people connecting with cannabis, right? So, but I had nothing else to lose. So I was like, okay, let me try it. And to my surprise, it wasn't the first time I tried it. You know, the first couple of times I was like, what even is this? Am I feeling it? But the third time I connected with it, that's when it really hit me. And I remember in that moment feeling like, wow, I feel the most me I've felt in a long time. And in that moment, I got to experience that dichotomy, right? Of being the observer who was experiencing the thoughts of anxiety coming from different parts of me, but that was not anxiety, right? Like, so I got to realize, like, well, if I'm not my thoughts, then who am I? And I didn't have an answer to that. And that really started my entire spiritual quest, right? And it didn't really get like, there was iterations of this or levels, if you will. But that was like my first big like aha moment. And so I continued connecting with cannabis. I stopped and ditched the pharmaceutical because they weren't working anyway. And, very similar to many people, I found something that I loved with cannabis, but I did not know how much was too much. I did not understand about masking emotions. I did not understand about codependency. I didn't understand about any of this stuff. And so, like many people, I eventually found myself as a daily user. Now, at the end of the day, to me at that point, it wasn't that big of a challenge for me because I was like, wow, this is amazing. I can go to school. I can live a pretty much normal life. But as we both know, like cannabis is fantastic at helping us with a lot of things. It's also fantastic at helping us unlock and bring up our shadow. And so through that time, I was experiencing, like great highs and then also times where I would have anxiety come forth and paranoia. And of course, at my limited perspective at that point, I started believing, oh, certain strains just give me anxiety, right? Not that they can bring up these things or create a physiological reaction with increased heart rate and, fight or flight response that can produce paranoia or anxiety, but that they were just doing it, right? And so when I was 18, I left high school and started going to college for psychology. And about a year in, at this point, I was still pretty unhealthy. I mean, I was like every 18-year-old out there pretty much. And so, one day I woke up and I went to the bathroom and I started peeing blood and I had no idea why. Right. So I tell my dad and he takes me to the hospital. And on the way there, I'm obviously like freaking out. I'm like, holy shit, why am I peeing blood? And he's like, Ryan, I just got to know, are you doing drugs? Right? The classic parent question. And I said, no, but I am connecting with a lot of cannabis, like a lot of it. And I saw that when I said that, he didn't make it like super obvious, but I saw, because I was like super heightened in terms of like senses at that point, because I was so scared, I saw him have a sigh of relief, right? As if like, okay, this isn't that bad. We can work with that. Now, my dad and I had never really had the conversation, but he had kind of just said like, just stay away from it, that kind of thing. Now, obviously my dad kind of assumed that I was connecting with it. My parents' house was kind of like the hangout house. And so, they had some ideas, So when I went to the hospital, I brought my laptop with me. And when my father stayed with me for the 4 days I was in there, I started showing him a lot of the research I had been doing on cannabis, a lot of the new science coming out. One of the videos was Leaf by Dr. William Courtney, where basically he had a patient with, I think, 11 autoimmune disorders, a good amount of them anyway. And he had found that by juicing raw cannabis leaves for the THCA, so no intoxicating effects whatsoever, he was able to put all of her conditions, all of her autoimmune disorders into remission. And then at the end, they get married. It's like pretty cool, And so I showed him that. That's a pretty quick video. Showed him a bunch of stuff. And to my dad's, credit, he had no cognitive dissonance. He was like, wow, I guess we didn't know what we didn't know back in the 70s and 80s. And so at that point, we had a conversation while I was in the hospital. And he was like, listen, man, he's like, I know what you went through with anxiety. If this is helping you, you're in school, you got a job, you got your life together and on track, like you're an adult. Who am I to tell you can't do this? If this works for you, awesome. And so from that moment forward, it became something where he was like, listen, because I was still living with him at this point. He's like, listen, you can do it in the house. No one cares. Your mom doesn't care. So from that point forward, it became a connection medicine for my father and I. And I thought that was great. I thought I had figured it out, right? Like I thought like, wow, this really helped me with my anxiety. This is awesome. My dad and I are connecting on it. Really cool. So now I get into my second year of school. And I start realizing real quickly that I'm not going to be happy wearing khakis the rest of my life. So I start having a dark night of the soul a little bit and realizing what the hell am I going to do with this psychology degree? And at this point, like, it seems like yesterday, but it was long ago, right? So there wasn't as many options as there were today with a psychology degree, right? And so I go to the Boston Freedom Rally that year, which is a big public display of disobedience where before it was legal, because it's fully legal now, people would come out, into the green of the commons. They would interact with cannabis. And so long as they weren't doing anything that crazy, the cops would just leave us all alone. And so I go there one year And I forget my sunglasses, right? Because at this point I had been used to wearing sunglasses and I got baby blues. So, the sun can be really intense sometimes. So I get out from the train, I walk up and I'm like, oh man, I can't see anything. So I start hearing this guy audibly, right when I get onto the commons, yelling, who wants to make butter with me? So I go over, I grab his little pamphlet, and to my shock and surprise, he's opening a Cannabis Institute 5 minutes from my house, right? Because this is in Boston. I live 20 minutes south of Boston. He was opening in the town next door, like literally a 5 minute drive from my house. So this was one of the first fuck yeses from my heart that I ever felt. So I go home, I tell my dad, I'm like, Dad, this thing, I'm super charged up about it. And my dad and I, at that point, I had convinced him to buy me a grow kit. Medical had passed. And so we had tried one harvest on our own. Absolutely terrible, dude. It was like, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, right? And so he was like, well, listen, this is a hobby you want to get into. You're legally able to do it. You're very interested in cannabis. He had seen all the research I've been doing. And I was like, Dad, can you help me pay tuition? I think it was like $500, but I was a broke college student. So he's like, I'll do one better, man. How about I go with you? I'm curious about learning about this. At this point, he had not been connecting with cannabis in any way, shape, or form. He was just really enthused and excited about what I was into. So we start going there together. First time I go there, I'm like, this is what I want to do, right? It was just everything. It was like, in Euro Trip, that movie where he's like, this isn't where I parked my car. Well, that was exactly where I parked my car. Like it was blatantly obvious to me. And so I go there, my dad gives me the speech of like, listen, this is what you want to do. Be the first one in, last one out every day. Keep asking them to work for them, yada, yada. So I end up interning for them. I end up working for them. And I end up learning from all of these amazing individuals that they're connected with on subjects such as organic regenerative agriculture, cannabis pharmacology, the physiological effects of cannabis, the history of it, all the science of it. I mean, pretty much anything and everything. It was like a buffet there. And so I just was really just, excited in taking all of this in. And so, at this point, dispensaries had not opened yet in Boston, but I knew they were going to. Medical had passed, and so it was just a matter of time. So I'd had my eyes on that. And in 2014, I went to my first music festival and I connected with MDMA for the first time. And at this point, like I had done cannabis, but I had never tried anything else, not psilocybin, LSD, nothing, right? And so this was my first other thing I tried. So I did a lot of research on it first. I obviously knew not to combine it with alcohol. I figured out a whole supplement list for my friends because it was two of my friends we were going out there with. And so none of us had ever tried it. So we were like, okay, we knew that a friend out there had a trusted source. So we planned this all out and I read about, okay, it's a heart opener. I don't know what that means, but okay, I'll figure it out. And so there I am in the crowd of like 50,000 people, my first time ever doing MDMA. And during it, I felt this really interesting feeling directly in my heart. And all it was coming up for me was stuff about my dad. And I had no idea why, but I figured logically, like my left brain kicked in. It was like, well, you're in Vegas. Your dad likes gambling. Well, you're going to steakhouses. You and your dad go to steakhouses. You just miss your dad, man. You wish he was here. He loves Vegas, yada, yada. So I just chalked it up as nothing. Well, when I got back, I realized that feeling had not been unwarranted. So after I got back, about 9 days after I got back, my father told me that he had gone for a checkup and was diagnosed with terminal stage 4 cancer. It had already metastasized to his brain. They think it started in his lungs. He was smoking like a chimney type of guy, tobacco anyway. And so, I had a real challenge in that moment because I realized, and again, the language I use today is not probably how I would have stated it back then, but I'll do it for the sake of a better term. So I realized that I essentially fractured in that moment, right? Like my dad tells me he's now standing there. He looks the exact same he always has, but I'm like numb and frozen. And it wasn't even like a conscious thing. I just knew something wasn't right because I wasn't able to feel it whatsoever. And so here's my dad. He doesn't want to be considered the sick guy. I don't want to treat him like the sick guy, but how am I supposed to just like, all right, brush this off and keep going on with my life? And so my dad elected to not do chemo and radiation because he had just finished bringing his brother every week for 3 years to Dana-Farber in Boston for his cancer treatment. He had large cell carcinoma. My father had small cell, much more aggressive. And so my dad had witnessed the slow decline of his brother, right? To a point where like his brother was not even there basically. And so he was like, fuck that. If I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out with my dignity and my hair because he had fucking awesome hair. That's where I get it from, right? So I had a dichotomy in that moment. I was like, okay, do I choose to love my father for who he is, right? And at this point, I'd gotten so into holistic health and everything, because after that, peeing blood incident, which was a benign cyst on my kidney that broke open, I always forget to say that, I had realized my choices matter. So here I am, like Mr. Holistic Health now. And so in this moment, I have a decision to make. I'm like, okay, do I love my dad for who he has always been, the man who's loved me, my best friend, all of these kind of things, but also the person who's not the best with his health, right? Or do I choose to make him into the version of him that I think he should be, so that I can selfishly maybe have him around longer, but also potentially destroy his quality of life, trying to make him live a totally different way that he wants to? So luckily, I chose the first way. And I said, okay, what do we do with this? Like, what do you want my help with? And so, we started, he was like, hey, I want to shift some things in diet, things like that, but I'm not going to quit smoking. I'm like, okay, no worries. So after a couple of weeks, he started experiencing some severe pain. And so we turned our last harvest that we ever grew together into RSO. And I had met with many people face to face, because at this point in 2014, this information was not as public as it is now. But there's a lot of PubMed studies people can look up of how THC kills cancer cells, how CBD inhibits its growth, and who knows what all the other stuff in cannabis does. But it all really works in that synergistic fashion to remediate cancer and many other things as well. And so I had met a lot of these people face to face that were coming in with their scans showing stage 3, stage 4 cancer, then going home over 3 to 6 months, getting their diet in order, all these things, interacting with RSO or FICO, and being able to have their tumor shrink and potentially go away altogether. I met at least 10 people that had completely killed their cancer. Dana-Farber was like shocked. They were like, no, you're not just using cannabis. So it was very interesting. So we decided, okay, I knew already I wasn't going to save my dad's life, but I knew that I could potentially increase his life, and also quality of life as well. And so I started feeding him RSO. And when I would feed it to him, I would sit with him, because here's someone who's never interacted with cannabis pretty much in his life, since the 80s anyway, now getting given the strongest form of cannabis on planet Earth, right? So I was sitting with him, and this is where I really discovered, Adam, the power of cannabis. I thought I figured it out with my own issues, right? But I started to realize that even though my dad and I, I'm an only child, I have a stepbrother and stepsister, but they weren't growing up in the same household. So my dad and I were like this, same with my mom as well. And so I thought, I'm like, I got my dad figured out. I know his stories. I know his, I know everything about him, right? Well, when I started sitting with him during these cannabis sessions, a whole new version of my dad opened up, a very soft version, right? One that was much more open, much more vulnerable. I got to hear stories about his childhood that I'd never heard before. I got to watch him have closure and create closure with his grandchildren, with his other children, with me, with my mother, and most importantly, his own mortality. We got to take the heaviness out of subjects like death. We got to talk about what he thought would happen when he passed over the veil. And there was a heaviness taken out of it. Of course, it was sad still, but it was almost like it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of another chapter in a series of infinite chapters. And it allowed us to embody that, even though I didn't have the language for that at that point. I wasn't that deep into spirituality. He definitely wasn't, but it gave us that experience. And you and I were talking before we hit record of, learning things through intellect versus having direct experience. And so I did not know what the hell I just experienced, but I knew it had changed my entire life. And so what happened was he got diagnosed July 9th. I didn't know at the time, but he was only given until Halloween. He never really let me in on that. So a couple of months later, my mother had told me that. And so he ended up lasting all the way until June the next year. Now, I don't know if that was 100% cannabis that did that, but I do know, based on his scans, logically, that his tumors were shrinking. They were still growing, but they were shrinking and also growing at a much slower rate. And there was no new ones coming forth, because his first couple of scans before he started RSO, it was just more and more and more. So I know that happened. Now, do I know objectively? No. But what I choose to believe, based off of the evidence that I felt and also the experience I had, was that cannabis gave me time with my father that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And it allowed me to create a lot of closure before he had actually passed. And so that moment, right, where he passed, and, he got to pass at home just like he wanted to. He got to have his dignity and his hair. He got to have everything he wanted. There was a profound moment where I realized, wow, that medicine allowed us to connect in such a way. I had no way to explain it. All I knew was that cannabis helped me with anxiety, but also at that point, I had realized that I was smoking cannabis all day, every day, and probably, soft talk acknowledged, was not tapping into this power very often. And so that was like the Easter egg, right? But it didn't fully hatch until about 3 or 4 years later. So after he passed, I ended up getting into a dispensary, worked there for 5 years with over 5,000 medical patients, helped them with a range of different things based on cannabis and also holistic health, like the other pieces of the puzzle that create holistic health, other than just plant medicines. I also worked as a cultivator. I'd been growing at this point for, I think, 7 years, about 13 now. And so I was working, doing a lot of different things there, having an absolute blast. And what I noticed, though, is after about 3 years working there, we got bought out by a corporation. And it started smelling like office supplies and khakis in there real quick. And I was like, this is exactly more of what I didn't want. And so I am so grateful at this point in my life for that company buying us out. Now, I'll be completely honest. I played the fucking victim card so hard when they bought us out. I was like, fuck these people. This isn't what I want, because they were doing some really shitty stuff. They were firing everyone that had created the brand. These were people that had no idea about anything to do with cannabis. They were literally doing everything that triggered the fuck out of me. Now, in my victim state, it was like, why me? This company was great, yada, yada. But now in hindsight, I am so grateful for them. And I would literally hug them because they triggered me so hard that even my ego was like, we got to leave here. Right. And if that hadn't happened, I could still be working there. Right. And so this is a perfect example of how sometimes, right, we get gifts in really weird wrapping paper, and this was one of them. And so it triggered me so hard that through a series of other very fortunate events, I went to Vegas again for MJ BizCon to go out there and say, fuck them, I'm going to find my own investors. I'm going to bring love-grown cannabis to the world, and it's going to be easy. Well, I go out there, and it was like going into the belly of the beast. It was all the suit and ties, all the stuff that I didn't want. And so the last night there, my girlfriend and I, she worked at the dispensary as well. That's where we met. And so I asked her, I'm like, listen, it's our last night here. It was kind of like a dream dying in front of us. And so I was like, what do you want to do? And she was like, well, do you want to connect with some MDMA and go to a strip club? And I was like, hell yeah, like best girlfriend ever award. Let's go. Right. And so we decided now this is what I'll lay out here. Right. When I had gone out there, I had a lot of expectations. Right. My expectations were I'm going to find an investor. I'm going to find him or her at MJ BizCon. There was all these series of things that I planned out. Once I realized that wasn't going to happen, I lost all expectation. And now I was just there to have fun, right? I was there to have one last night, cool, whatever. So we connect with some MDMA. We go to the strip club. We have an absolute blast, just talking to strippers. As innocent as it sounds, I had never been to a strip club before. She never had either. So it was like, I don't know what to expect. So we go in there, we just have a blast. Strippers are like, man, you guys are cool. You just want to talk. So super fun. And at the end of that night, what happened was we were supposed to leave by about 4 a.m., right? Because we had a flight at 1 the next day. Rachel was working on a gigantic application for a Chicago, Illinois dispensary. Talk about boring. This is like the definition of boring, right? And she had done it because she wanted to leave the dispensary as well. She was trying to take side work, but it wasn't really in alignment. So she was feeling a lot of pressure to do this thing that her heart didn't want to do anyway. Well, by the time I realized the time, it was 8 in the morning, right? So I witnessed her go through this breakdown, right? Where she was like, oh my God, how am I going to find the energy to do this? I was supposed to do it on the plane. We're not going to get sleep. Oh my God. And in that moment, I realized that I fucked up, right? I realized that I was supposed to keep track of time and I didn't, right? And instead of trying to make an excuse or, say that it wasn't my fault, I just chose to go, yeah, it was my fault. I'm really sorry. And in that moment, right, when I did that, and of course, I'm sure the MDMA helped with this, right? I took my first step at a whole new lifestyle, right? Which was, what if instead of playing victim or playing and I didn't have the language to architect any of this, what if instead of doing any of that, I just take full ownership over my life? And I realized that if my life isn't where I want it to be, it's because of me. If I don't like the relationship I'm in, which obviously I do, but if I don't like the relationships or friendships I'm in, it's up to me, right? If I don't like the way a job's going, it's up to me to say something or leave, right? It's all up to me. And so from that moment, I realized, I'm like, why have I not been able to feel emotion? Because in that moment, I felt this feeling I hadn't felt in a while, which was the ability to feel. And so I start realizing that even though I had grieved a lot of my father when he was still alive, I had been really good at keeping myself just busy enough that I didn't have time, quote unquote, to dive into what was still in there. And so on the plane ride home, it was like being the eye of the storm, right? Here I am, 2 hours of sleep. I'm a prima donna for sleep, right? I'm on an airplane, one of my least favorite places to be. It's just everything should have led me to a really bad state of mind, but I was in a bliss state because I was feeling again. And I realized that I had power in my life again. And so I started asking my soul, I was like, why have I not been able to feel? And they were like, well, you've been numbing yourself out with cannabis, right? And it's not the plant's fault, it's your fault, right? Are you going to take ownership over this, or are you going to do the same pattern you did for the rest of your life, right? And so I decided, I was like, okay, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go home. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to figure out what's right. So I go home, cold turkey, just take a 3-month break. I've been a daily user for 15 years anyway. And so I go home and I take this break, and immediately, right when I started taking the break, normally what would happen is I would go to work, I would build up all the resentment and frustration I needed to go home and quit the job and find something out. But I would go home and just unconsciously smoke cannabis because I did it every night. So why not tonight? And it would relax me. And then I'd get to work the next day, and the cycle would just repeat itself. Well, when I stopped doing that, the job fucking sucked, and I ended up leaving like immediately. And it wasn't from a place of like, fuck you guys or anything. It was just like, hey, it's obvious that we want different things, and I wish you the best, right? And so I leave there. I start Highly Optimized. I start the podcast because I had been getting told for years I should start a podcast, and I wanted to. But everyone's doing it logically. Why would I do it? Any of these things? I just started saying fuck yes to everything my heart wanted. I started putting things out there, and the craziest synchronicities ensued, man. Like, I met my buddy Mark England, who I heard on a podcast 3 years before. And one day when I was pouring my heart out on Instagram, on Facebook, what happened was I ended up making a post that was talking about language and how it architects our reality. And someone had commented and said, oh, where'd you hear about that? And I tagged Mark, not thinking anything of it. Well, he messaged me. I ended up getting into his course. I ended up becoming a coach. I ended up coming down to his house in Virginia, which is what I was telling you about recently, and going into, just really meeting all of these amazing people that were all in direct alignment with what I was looking to become. And I just kept saying yes, right? So this is now, the pandemic started about a month after I got in the Mark's course. And I ended up flight prices were cheap. I ended up just meeting these individuals, and they'd be like, hey, we're doing this next. We're doing a retreat in Colorado. Okay, cool. I'll go there. Hey, I'm going to Mexico for 6 weeks. Okay, I'll go with them there. And for 2 years, I just kept saying yes, building my network, having experiences. And, again, we can dive much more into any one of these areas. But, over the last 3 or 4 years now, I've really been able to categorize all of these experiences and be able to speak directly to the challenges I've gone through with cannabis from the mindset of it was never cannabis's fault. That's my ultimate message. It's like, guys, you can say that cannabis is challenging for productivity. You can say whatever you want, but don't blame it on the plant, right? Say that, hey, when I connect with cannabis, I am not the most productive person. Don't say cannabis makes me unproductive. It doesn't make you anything, And so that's like a expose of how I got to this screen today. And there's many more things we can dive into, but I'll stop there because I know I've been chatting for a while.
I've literally been sitting here. I mean, you can probably even see through the camera just with full body truth bumps, because we have lived very different, but also very similar lives. And I've talked a lot about my personal experience with cannabis on this podcast many a times, and at how I finally realized my why for taking a pause from cannabis was going down to Peru and sitting with ayahuasca. And I made the decision that, okay, if I really want to connect with this plant, I need to disconnect with the other plant that has been a staple of my diet for a very, very long time. And through that experience, I recognized that how unhealthy that habit had become, even though and similar story to you, mine was a little bit early. I was diagnosed with ADHD and bipolar at 12 and put on medication from 12 until 20. And I will always remember in my earlier 20s of dating a couple of different individuals and telling them that, oh, well, I use cannabis because instead of using prescription medication, this helps me to stay balanced. It keeps me even keeled. It helps keep my emotions in check. Well, like many people who have used cannabis, you recognize the more you use it, the more you need to use it, and then the more you need to use it, and the more you need to use it. And eventually you start building this certain tolerance to where your body, at one point in time, it may have helped you to feel more and to feel more you. Then eventually you get over this precipice where now it just starts numbing you and keeping you confined within this box of, you can only feel a certain level of the spectrum. And through that retreat in Peru, I recognized at how limiting that spectrum had become, at how disconnected I had come from my wife, and how I wasn't really showing up in my relationship the way that I should. And I wasn't showing up for myself the way that I should. And I wasn't showing up for my friends and family. And all of these things just started flooding forth. And it was that same realization that it's not the plant's fault. All of these things exist inside of me. And I always reference to the fact that cannabis is a natural amplifier. It will amplify whatever is already existing in your subconscious mind. And that's why it is also very potent for shadow work, because it will straight up show you what you are hiding from and what you don't want to acknowledge exists within inside of you. So I love that you reference that it doesn't make you lazy. It amplifies the inherent laziness that you are willing to allow yourself to be. I was a very high functioning stoner. I would smoke and just mash out projects. Like, it allowed me to really zone in until, of course, I got to that same point where I was consuming too much, that then I did start to allow that inherent laziness that exists within all of us. I believe all of these tendencies we all have. Some of us may, of course, be a little bit more predisposed to that based upon our, parental programming and societal programming that we received earlier in our lives. But if we blame it on the plant, we're just giving our power away. And we're giving our power away that allows us to actually make a different choice. And we always have that choice. That's one of the things that I do love about cannabis, and why I do agree that it is not addictive in the terms that Western medicine describes as an addictive substance. An addictive substance is something that you are going to have to detox from a period of time. But I have done it numerous times. I'm sure you've done it numerous times, where you quit cold turkey. And yeah, there might be a couple of days where you're a little uncomfortable and your body's like, what the fuck? Where is this? Like, you've always given me at this time and at this time and at this time. Where is it now? But eventually, for me, it's after roughly about 3 days, my body starts to go, oh, okay, I'm back now to baseline. Now it's time to start reconfiguring how I operate and reconfiguring how I'm interacting with everything and everyone else, because now I'm having to create the cannabinoids myself. I'm no longer able to receive it outside of myself. And I think that's one thing that many people are maybe not quite on par with in the science and research, that we naturally produce cannabinoids. That's why we have a cannabinoid receptor system built inside of us. However, when you consume cannabis on the regular, the body is going to stop producing it naturally, because it's easier to take it in from that outside source, especially in the levels and concentration in which we start to consume it. And that's a whole nother thing. I went down a huge rabbit hole with concentrates when Washington became their legal system, and I no longer was able to produce it myself underneath the medical system that was an absolutely beautiful system until it was completely corrupt by the corporations that came in for profit. But concentrates, inherently, people think, okay, well, I can take, and I had the same thought, I can take less and receive just as much as what I was having to smoke a whole bowl or having to burn a whole bowl through my volcano or whatever it was, not recognizing that the process of creating concentrates actually disconnects the plant from the spirit of cannabis. And once I took a break several months ago, and have kind of been on pretty much a permanent break since then, that I recognized that that's really where I was no longer getting the major benefits that I was receiving when I was cultivating it myself and creating my own soil and giving it organic and veganic nutrients and channeling Reiki into my plants and playing music for them and talking to them and doing all of the things that I know you agree with and how it should be cultivated. And so it's like, when we can take that moment and step away, we can begin to have that awareness around when we come back into that relationship. And when I have sat in ceremony with cannabis in more recent times after taking a prolonged break, the power that she brings is night and day. And I can say wholeheartedly that I will never go back to being a daily user because of what I know now,
Yes,
because of the relationship that I have created now and how it has to be honored. You know, it's kind of like when you're in a relationship and if you have sex every single day, eventually the sex starts to lose the meaning.
definitely.
You don't connect in the same way with your significant other versus when some time has gone by and then you make that connection again. It's like, oh, this blissful state. The same thing goes with cannabis. And I also love how you use the word connect with all of the
Mm.
substances because that's what it's about. It's not about taking
Or using, you know?
or using, right? Because, you know, words, the reason it's called spelling is because we cast words with our
Hmm.
spells, or we cast spells with our words. So if we're using that term use or take, that just means that you're in it for yourself. But when you use the word connect, now that's a two-way road between you and that spirit. And how she shows up is very, very different. And how you show up is also going to be very different.
Absolutely. And, Adam, everything you just said, man, we're in so much alignment. And I took some notes because you brought up a lot of good things. And, the first thing was about shadow work, and I really feel cannabis is ultimate shadow work medicine. And I think that some people go, well, Ryan, like I don't always have challenging times when I go into cannabis. So how could it always be shadow work? I go, well, like think of it this way, right? Why does MDMA therapy work so well for PTSD, right? Because if you think about it, these people have challenging or traumatic memories and now they're going back to relive them. How could that possibly work? Well, they're in a totally different mindset and perspective from which they're viewing those past challenges, right? So with cannabis, yes, it can increase, certain things, dopamine, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, what I find is that depending on your perspective that day, you could connect with cannabis, see an aspect of your shadow, right? Let's say maybe, maybe laziness, right? We'll use that as an example, right? Maybe you've been hitting the gym, right? And maybe you realize like, there's something I just want to get going more, right? So you start hitting the gym, you're doing the things that you should be, right? To meet the goals that you have. And then you connect with cannabis, right? And you go, oh my God, I was lazy. Oh my God, I do have that trait in me, right? Well, because you're in a mindset where you can look back and go, well, I'm changing it, right? You might see that and be like, wow, that's really amazing. Versus another example where maybe someone told you, Adam, you're lazy, right? And you're like, fuck you. No, I'm not, right? Then you connect with the plant and you start seeing what you couldn't see before, right? Which is like, oh, fuck, I am being lazy. And in that moment, your ego goes, no way, right? And it starts to push it away and starts to refute it, AKA refuse an aspect of you. Well, now you're going to have a challenging time, right? But both of those aspects to me are shadow work, right? And I think shadow work gets this interesting rap where it always has to be doom and gloom. Shadow work, right? Like the great thing about shadow work is that also included into your shadow are the most divine aspects of you that you've yet to tune into, right? So for years before I started the podcast, I would see Aubrey Marcus, Joe Rogan, these individuals, and I would love their episodes, but there'd be a little part of me that was bitter, right? There'd be a little part of me that was like, fuck, because I knew that I could do that, right? But I wouldn't allow myself to do it because what if people think I sound dumb? What if my podcast gets no views? Things that honestly, it doesn't fucking matter because I'm enjoying it, right? But at that point, I thought it did. So a lot of times, like I tell everyone, if you spot it, you got it, right? So a lot of times people think of this only with like challenging things, but it also works with this. And I think this is referred to as the golden shadow, where let's say you see someone like I did, right, on a podcast, blah, blah. Well, the only reason you can tell how fucking awesome they are at that is because deep down in you, you know what it takes to be awesome at that thing, but you're not allowing yourself to do it because maybe you're afraid of the work it'll take or any of these things. But that's the ultimate power that shadow work has, right? Is not only to reveal where you might be holding yourself up in a negative way, but also the things you might be doing, the stories, the belief systems, etc., that you might be holding yourself up from experiencing the greatest highs in your life completely naturally with no substances added. So that's like why I feel cannabis is the ultimate shadow work medicine. And the other thing too, I'll throw in there too is, it's not that other medicines can't bring you there. They definitely do. But because cannabis still has your ego and default mode network online, I find it really good to do parts work with. And for shadow work, I enjoy doing parts work where I can have the ego tell its case, right? And then I can be the head of the dinner table that also hears the other side telling its case, and I can kind of mediate between them. And so it's similar, or as opposed to other medicines where you're kind of obliterating the ego, which has its own power in and of itself. But for this, I found cannabis to be the ultimate shadow work medicine. And when you were talking about addiction, I 100% agree with you. And this triggers the fuck out of a lot of people when I say cannabis is not addictive. And I go, guys, think about it this way, right? It's the same way that we hear that technology, right? Phones are so addicting, oh my God, they're so addicting. Well, what's interesting, right? I fell into that for a long time. And you can look at my user time and it's pretty fucking high most days, right? I'm a content creator and things like that. But then let's say I go down to the lake house in Virginia, my buddy Mark's. All of a sudden, I didn't try to redo any pattern or anything. All of a sudden, I'm like, fuck, where's my phone been? It's been like 3 days since I checked that thing. So is technology addicting, or is technology being addicting the result of the real problem, which is like boredom, lack of meaning, et cetera, right? So when you think about cannabis, is it that cannabis is addictive, or is it that whatever you're running from shit is very addictive, and you will seek out anything in your life to provide comfort if you don't know how to provide it to yourself? So I tell everyone, guys, it's not about logically saying, well, the textbook says it's addictive. I go, do you really want to live into that mentality that you have no power over something and that it's just blatantly, objectively addictive? Or do you want to actually look at the real problem here, which is you're running from something if you're dependent and using cannabis every day. And if you just go over the cannabis addiction, you're just going over the result. You're not actually looking at the problem. So what might happen, hopefully, fingers crossed, if you do it that way, is maybe you'll find a healthier addiction, like exercise, right? Or reading or something like that. But like we were talking about before, it's like the people that are very much into alcohol or drugs. They then get clean and they become an addict of AA and NA, right? Now, again, safer, albeit, right? But the pattern underlying is still leading to a lack of fulfillment and a lack of ease and peace within you because you haven't actually dealt with the real challenges there, right? And so just like the Tao talks about, everything's about the middle way, right? So for me, I knew when I quit cannabis, after a month, I really realized no, this is definitely a me thing. I realized, well, I'm not going to stay away from cannabis forever, but I'm also going to take full accountability and be able to actually ask myself the hard questions when I connect with it, which is, am I running from something? And if I am, I'm not going to connect with a plant, as hard as that's going to be, because it's just going to reinforce that pattern that's disempowering and isn't leading to any good results in my life. And so I'm so glad you brought up addiction, because I feel a very similar way about that. And the last thing you were talking about was when you're connecting with cannabis every day, right? Or I think you used the example with your partner. If you're having sex with your partner every day, you miss a lot of the subtleties, right? So for instance, if you're having sex with your partner every day, you might just start rushing the process of foreplay, right? You just want to have sex, right? But you're missing a lot of what does it feel like when you haven't seen your partner in 3 days, right? That buildup, that excitement, right? That's a subtlety that you might miss if you're doing it every day. So with cannabis, I use this analogy a lot, right? It's kind of similar to the one you talked about. So imagine that you have been living with someone, your romantic partner, for 10 years, right? You guys haven't gone on many vacations. You're living together. You work from home together. So you guys see each other all day. And so, you wake up the same way, they give you a kiss on the cheek the same way when you wake up, they make your breakfast the same way, yada, yada, yada. It's just part of your routine. Let's say now that person, your romantic partner, leaves on an epic month-long retreat, right, with their friends. They're going to go have a blast, right? And you're like, this is awesome. First day you wake up, you might even be like, wow, this is cool. I get the house to myself. About day 7, you're going to be like, holy fuck, I never realized how shitty I make my own sweet potatoes. I never realized how much love that person put into cooking everything that they cook for me. I never realized how they made the house a home. You start realizing all the little things because they always talk about, the little things actually are the big things. And so it's with cannabis, it's very similar. I tell everyone, you'll find more of what you love about cannabis in its absence than you will when it's actually with you. And I'm not saying that you won't find things you love about it when you connect with it, because you will, but it's really fun to play this this lack of codependency game, like a power couple game, right? Where you can flirt with the plant, you can build things up, right? You can actually bring to it questions, right? For me, I go Monday through Friday, no cannabis, because that's the time that I'm most prone to stressing out. And I want that time. I want to feel that stress. I want to figure out where my triggers are. I want to figure out what I'm getting held up by, so that then when I go to connect with the plant, I go, hey, there's this thing around me being productive that is now leading me to saying yes to everything, and I'm getting burned out. Where does this come from? And then I can connect with the plant, go in, do some shadow work, and realize, oh, fuck, I got that from my mother, or oh, fuck, I got that from my father. Okay, it's not cured there, but I have the awareness. Now I can come back into my body. And the next week, I can, on Sunday, let's say, make plans of what I'm going to do differently that week to reinstate this new pattern that cannabis showed me, right? Then that next week, I go no cannabis again, and I try integrating that pattern. Maybe I realize it worked good everywhere, but maybe one area. So then I go back to the plant. Hey, what happened here, right? And so in this way, it's really similar to meeting with a coach, right? Like the coach says, hey, this is what you're going to do this week. You go try to do it. You're like, I got hung up here. You text your coach. They help you. You keep doing it. Like I tell everyone, like, cannabis, plant medicines, coaches, anyone that's going to help you in life, they can give you the what, right? Like the what the thing is to actually help you get better or feel better. But it's up to us to do the how, and to figure out the how. And that's our end of the bargain. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused with cannabis or any, really thing in life, is that the plant won't solve your issues for you. It will show them to you in a very objective, neutral way. And how you take those things is ultimately going to depend on whether or not you're going to be able to be in a healthy, conscious relationship with the plant, or if you're just going to give your power away and maybe give up the plant forever and then just translate the addiction into something else, And so, yeah, it's very interesting you brought those things up. Direct alignment.
Yeah. And the factor of, I love that you brought up coaching and how it's very similar in that way. And I've had people ask me before, when I first shifted from my old industry to now shifting into coaching, like, why would somebody hire a coach? Well, if you're not happy with certain aspects in your life and you can't figure out what that is yourself, you need another perspective to be able to shine the light on where the work actually lies, and then help to give you a map to get from point A to point B. And my coaching program is called The Journey Back to Self. It's all about coming back to your authentic self and letting go of the subconscious programming, the limiting beliefs, all the bullshit that you keep telling yourself that you are, only because somebody at one point in time told you that that's what you are. And then you took it on as your own truth and you started to believe it. Cannabis, for me, just like what you've been talking about, was that light for a very, very long time. And I didn't really feel that I needed a coach or I needed somebody else. And then I got into the coaching space and realized, like, wow, I don't actually have all this figured out. So let me hire a coach that has helped me to really work through and see where I'm actually holding myself back and not putting myself out there the way that I should be to bring on new clients or to actually be able to show up more. And it goes to show it how much continued education we all need to keep going through, that will never stop for the entirety of our lives, because, as I have tattooed on my wrist, we are perfectly imperfect people.
Yes. I love that, man. It's 100% accurate. And, it's funny when I talk to people about the coaching thing, because I have a lot of people ask me the same thing. Why would I hire a coach? And I go, well, it depends on what you value, right? Like, I'm not going to tell you should hire a coach, but do you believe that money is more valuable or time? Right? That will ultimately decide, or be the deciding factor of whether or not you understand why you should work with a coach, right? If money is your top thing, well, then no, you wouldn't work with a coach. Why would you do that? You're going to spend money. And if your main thing is money, then you're going to want to save that, right? But overall, the most valuable resource in life is not money, not by a long shot. It's time, right? And so if I can talk to someone, if I have a goal, right, a big goal that I want to reach, like going on Aubrey Marcus, or like creating a program or something that I've never done before, right? Do I want to try, in my limited perspective, to figure it out myself and waste a lot of time and a lot of money, actually, in a paradoxical way, trying to figure this thing out by, doing all these different things? Or do I want to work with someone who has climbed that mountain before and goes, hey man, you want to go to the top of that mountain? Cool. I've been there. I'm not going to do the work for you. You're still going to have to walk up the mountain, but I'll make sure that you don't fall off, because I know where the ledges start crumbling. I know where the trolls on the way are going to try to get us, right? And I can make sure that you get around that, but it's still up to you to walk the path, right? That, to me, is the argument for having a coach. That's why I'll always have a coach. And it's funny, because if you look at any truly successful person, and success is a word that's thrown around a lot too, but I'm talking truly fulfilled people, right? Like, yes, financial wise, they're probably set, right? But much more than that, right? If they're truly fulfilled, they all have mentors, a coach, a guide, whatever the hell name you want to put on it. This is not a new thing, right? Like, it might seem new because maybe the term coach is new, but I mean, any truly successful person is standing on the shoulders of giants, right? And so like the idea here is that the reason you'd work with a coach is if you're serious about your mission, serious enough to realize that right now you might not have all the things you need to be able to accomplish that mission. And also time's ticking away. And our time here is finite, right? Like, our fingerprints have never and will never walk the planet again. It's what we want to do with our fingerprints in that time that really matters. And for me, that is the most important thing for me. I have a big mission that I want to achieve, and there's nothing that's going to stand in my way. So why would I not work with a coach, And so that's like how I explain it to people. It's like, it depends on whether or not you've been tricked into believing money is the most important thing and you got to save and squirrel everything away to the detriment of your own fulfillment. Or if you're going to find a way to be able to have enough money to pay your rent and do the things you do, but also work with someone that can help you hack the time sequence, because again, time is the most valuable resource.
Yeah. Well, and what's funny about that, and I love that you keep bringing up the fact that it's a paradox, is the paradox of not wanting to spend money and invest into yourself, because that's what hiring a coach is you're investing into yourself. By you not wanting to invest into yourself is telling the universe that you're worried that if you spend that money, you're not going to get more money back. So by not actually investing into yourself, you're continuing to feed into your scarcity mentality, continuing to stop abundance from coming to you. And thus, by not spending that money, you're actually keeping more money from coming to you.
Exactly.
It's just such a weird mentality that I honestly didn't understand for a very long time. I had invested in myself as far as going to retreats and education through learning how to do Reiki and breath work and all of the various modalities that I bring into my coaching programs. But I had never actually taken the leap until this year of hiring a coach myself, because it was that mentality of like, well, it's a lot of money to spend, and if I spend that, what if it doesn't work out? And then I had to ask myself that question, okay, but what if you do spend that money and it does work out? Well, actually, that may be a little bit more scary than if it doesn't work out, because if it doesn't work out, I know where that road leads. But if it does work out, all of a sudden now I have to become a different person. Now I have to show up differently because actually the dreams that I've always wanted are finally coming true. Oh no. And so the more I went down that rabbit hole, the more I realized, like, I finally booked a call with a coach that I resonated with, that, the way that he his philosophy is coaching is from a heart-centered place. And that very much is in alignment with what I believe, is that we're trying to make that longest 18-inch journey from our head to our heart, and learning how to operate from that space is what is actually going to allow us to live our best life. Okay, let me book this call. And before I even got 5 minutes into that call, it was already a yes. But I still allowed him to go through his sales pitch and have the long conversation. And finally, when we got down to it of like, okay, this is what it's going to be, I was like, fine, let's do it. Here's my credit card. Let's go. Happy to get those points.
Dude, I love that, Adam. And it's funny because a lot of my friends that, I've met over the last 3 or 4 years, I mean, mostly coaches and everything, it's been so fun, like, to be able to meet so many people on a similar path, because now it's like, it's just normal. Like, I'm around coaches all the time. There's people on, coaching calls everywhere. I mean, it's so normal to me now. And they all have a saying that I picked up, which is, what if the good shit, right? So we're used to saying like, what if it doesn't work out? What if I don't make my money back? What if I go broke? Well, what if the good shit happens? What if you end up creating a podcast that helps millions of people take back their power? What happens if you create a platform for cannabis where people really start being able to connect with the plant in the ways that is possible, right? Like, what if all of that happens? What if you're able to go meet amazing people that once you meet, you have no idea how you existed in this lifetime without having them? It's like, what if all of that stuff? But I think we've been trained in a lot of ways to play it safe. And I'm not saying that's inherently bad, but it's important to be able to have that full spectrum conversation, right? Of like, okay, yes, what are the risks, right? What are the risks? Am I not going to have a place to live? Okay, like, there are certain things that, are very important, right? But what I've found, especially with the people that I've worked with as well, is that all too often they have their needs met. They have a good little chunk of change saved up. But like you were saying, they're unaware of the fact that money is currency, right? And if you're holding it statically, it isn't able to flow, right? It doesn't mean that you should just go buy random stuff, but invest, right? And the best investment you can make is in yourself. Now, at the end of the day, I tell my clients too, I'm like, listen, if you can't pay your own rent and you can't afford food, I don't think you should be trying to hire a coach right now, right? But for 99.9% of the people out there, that's not the case. They're just telling themselves some bullshit story of why it's not going to work for them, you know? And again, like that's their prerogative. I tell everyone, like, I'm not going to tell you what story you should tell yourself, but I am going to be the voice of reason. Sometimes they can say, well, have you thought about this? Okay, now go think about these things and see what you discern for yourself. Because I think, as you'll agree, like any good coach's job is to invite people and to provide an invitation, but not to tell anyone anything, right? Like, you know, not saying that telling is bad. It's more consulting work, right? Which, like, when I'm teaching people how to grow, I'm not going to be like, well, what do you think the plant needs? You know, I'm going to tell them what the plant needs right at the bat and then coach them how to figure out what the plant needs on their own. But, you know, it's like, I think for these kind of things, I always tell people, like, listen, ultimately, you're only going to know the answer for yourself. But what I tell everyone is, like, listen, the second that you decide to say yes, I'll never let you fail. But until you say yes, it's not a good energetic reciprocity, because if I'm providing value and you're not providing value back in terms of like having skin in the game, well, then you're just going to fuck around, right? Like that's why free things never really work. When I first got into coaching, my ultimate thing was like, I'm going to give out free sessions. People are going to love them. You know what happened more than anything? I would set up these sessions, these practice sessions. I would book them out and people would no-show all the fucking time. As soon as I started charging, no one missed those fucking calls. Why? Because they have skin in the game now. There's a positive energetic reciprocity. And I think that's so essential. And that's why I've paid hundreds of thousands of dollars at this point to invest in myself, you know, because it's the only investment that always pays back dividends so long as I actually do the work. And I know that if I have skin in the game and I'm paying someone, you know, $1,500, $2,000 a month or something like that, there's no fucking way in hell I'm not showing up at the calls. I'm not going to do the work. Like I am doing it all because I know how much skin I have in the game. And so it's that other weird paradox where, you know, for a long time I thought that spending money would make me more anxious. It's actually like when I'm doing something for free, I'm like, fuck it. Why would I even do this? Right. But when I have skin in the game, there's no way I'm fucking around. It's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's so many great points. And I'm looking at the clock and trying to be mindful of your time because I know you've got another podcast scheduled after this. So we'll I think we may end up having to do like a part 2 to dive into some more of the stuff that we wanted. And I think that would actually be great for this season.
Hell yeah.
You'll be the first one that I've brought back in the same season. I've had a conversation with many other individuals where we wanted to dive deeper, but I feel like we could probably talk for hours upon hours upon hours on a lot of these topics. So to try and wrap things up, I'll just ask you the embrace and expand question that I ask all of the guests of, Ryan, what did you have to embrace in your life in order to expand into the person you are today?
Oh man, that's a really good question. And dude, it's so fun podcasting with other podcasters because I have a last question I ask too. And I always love when people have a last question because it just ties everything together. And that's a really good one. So, you know, going on this line of what we were talking about before about coaching, I had to embrace that I did not know all the answers. And honestly, I had to embrace that I didn't really know me. And I didn't, like, it wasn't from a place of like, oh, blame, victim myself, anything. It was like, hey, I really don't know what I don't know. And in order to, you know, persevere and be able to evolve into the person that I want to be, into the life of, into the amount of fulfillment I want in life and these kind of things, I must realize that I don't know what I don't know and embrace the not knowing and be able to ask good questions and ask for help. And so that's ultimately been the main subject matter over the last 4 years of what I've really had to embrace in order to expand.
I love that. And that's an answer that we have yet to get on the podcast. Out of all of the questions, I've had 2 of the same answers, but they were told slightly differently. So it's always unique to see it how everybody has really had to embrace something different within their life in order to admit where they need to go. And that answer of having to embrace that you don't totally know yourself is such a beautiful answer.
Okay.
Because the reality is most of us don't truly know who we are because we've been trying to live up to this personification that other people have told us that we should be. I can think of so many things I wanted to be when I was a little kid, and so many people, like, I wanted to be a photographer. And I had many people tell me photography is a really competitive industry and maybe you should think about doing something different. So I thought about doing something different and I did do something different. But I think if I actually had pursued photography way back then, I would have already achieved taking photos for National Geographic, like what was one of my dreams, and doing those things. Because if you look at my Instagram, I take some pretty awesome
Yeah, you
photos with
do.
just my iPhone because I have this certain eye that really photographers that know what they're looking at has. It's a certain perspective.
Mm,
And that's where I love cannabis. I love plant medicines. I love meditation. I love breath
mm,
work. All of these various different holistic approaches allow us to change our perspective.
mm.
And it's through that shift in perspective and where I love the term altered states of consciousness, but most people think of altered states of consciousness as I'm seeing crazy colors or I'm meeting entities in the DMT realm and things like that. An altered state of consciousness can literally be found by walking in the woods and hearing a bird that you had never heard for the very first time. And that changes your view on the world.
Exactly. Dude, I love that, man. And I 100% agree. Like, altered states are something that, again, you can get with breathwork, you can get meditating, you can get walking in the woods, you can get trying a new food that you've never tried before that you're like, oh my goodness, right? And, I think that the more that we create these platforms that can talk about these things and take the stigma out of them, right? Not just plant medicines, but all these things like, hey, I don't know everything about myself. Oh, geez, right? Like, because at the end of the day, I think that we all deep down want to be more vulnerable. But I think, especially for men, we've grown up in a world where it was kind of like shaky. At least in our generations, it wasn't like, don't cry, but it was like, think about it before you do it, And now it's starting to be obviously a lot healthier. But I think that, at least for me, like I was raised and my parents did an amazing job of raising me and always allowing me to, express my emotions and things like that. But it wasn't until I got into the coaching circles and going to retreats that I witnessed this happen, right? It would happen to me where, like, say, beginning of a share circle, say you get called on first. I'm like, yeah, there was some stuff that came up and it was all good. It was good. It was good exercise, right? The next guy goes, yeah, it was some stuff that came up around my parents and it was a good exercise, right? Next guy's like, yeah, it was some stuff that came up around my parents. I'm worried about them dying. I don't know if they're going to die. Really good exercise. Every time someone shares just a little bit more vulnerably. And by the end, right, if I was the first one to go, I'd be like, can I share again? Actually, that was totally not nearly what I wanted to state, because now every person has provided a little bit of that permission slip. And so my hope, and I imagine you agree with this too, and considering how vulnerable you get too, is that, like I know how it feels to be the person who's never been that way, like never been super vulnerable yet. But at the same time, I also know how empowering it is when the person who's seasoned there goes, hey, I'll do it first. I'll be the one that really opens it up and makes myself super vulnerable so that we all know we're on a level playing field here. Because, at the end of the day, none of us have all the answers. None of us truly, I'm not going to say none of us truly know who we are, right? But if we haven't dove into spirituality, we only know who our ego sense is, right? As me as Ryan or you as Adam, right? And there's much more to it than that. And I don't pretend to know it all, but I know how much I don't know. And that at least gives me a lot of awareness. So I'm glad you brought that up as well. It's really cool, man.
Yeah. And vulnerability really is a very, very underestimated superpower. Because when you can be truly vulnerable, you give everybody else the permission slip around you that it's okay to be vulnerable. And some of my reels that actually get and still continue to get the most amount of views are reels of me in a breathwork session where I am screaming at the top of my lungs. And I talk about it, what I had to go through in dealing with those emotions and allowing those things to come out. And immediately on the other side of all of that sacred rage that I allowed to come out was a lot of grief and sadness that I hadn't allowed myself to feel. But being able to feel that in a safe container, in a safe environment where everybody else is going through similar experiences, again, it only happens when you are around other people that are willing to go that deep. And many coaching circles and spiritual communities will talk about you can only go as deep as you have gone yourself.
Exactly. No tree's branches can reach to heaven if its roots haven't reached to hell, and it's the ultimate dichotomy, right? It's the ultimate expression of yin and yang. It's all these things, right? But I always rely on Joseph Campbell's quote that bliss is any emotion felt all the way through. Not because I believed it the first time I heard it, but because I wanted to believe it. And because I wanted to believe it, I then had the experience. And I'm sure we'll get into this bigger in the next episode. But, it's like I had a 5-gram mushroom experience one time where it was a couple of years after my father passed, and it all came out. And it was the most blissful moment ever of just allowing my body to feel in order to heal. And, ever since that time, it really changed everything for me. And that was even before I got into coaching. So that really led me into getting into these circles, but still there was hesitation, and that's why it was so amazing being around other people when I was first getting into this that were like, we'll show you how vulnerable you can get, like, again, the invitation's there, you don't have to, but those people showing me really helped a lot shape now how I'm okay with being vulnerable. I don't care, if someone tries to hop on my Instagram comments or whatever and call me a name or whatever, I know it's coming from them, and that's based on the law of correspondence, right? Like the Hermetic principles have helped me out so much because, again, that and the 4 agreements, right? Like, realizing that if someone is willing to take time out of their day to spend their time and attention talking shit to you on the internet, it means that they're in a really disempowered state and they're looking to bring you down to their level so that they can commiserate with you, right? And so what they want is for you to attack them back. And when you don't, you take away the fuel to their fire and hopefully give them a different perspective on, like, I just tell them, like, hey guys, I'm not going in with you on that. Seems like you followed my profile and you don't really know what I do. So if you want to have a conversation, let's talk about it. Otherwise, have a great day, and so it's interesting, but I'm glad you brought that up because, I think for me, like, I'm at a point where I realize the things that really work for me. And if people online think that I'm being a certain way or over vulnerable, whatever, I don't care, because you know what? If I stop myself from being fully me, the only thing I do is I stop myself from being able to actually help the people that were willing and ready to listen to the message that I had. And my message isn't for everyone, as I'm sure yours isn't, and everyone's, right? Like, we can't be for everyone. And so the more that we try to be for everyone, the more we dull and water down our message. And the more that ultimately we end up wasting a lot of people's time because they might think we're someone that we're really not. And when they find out, they're like, dude, I've been following you 3 years and I thought you were this, but now you're that, right? So at the end of the day, I realized early on that I was going to be fully me. And there might be some people that are like, hey, I don't believe in that. Cool. Awesome. Go find your teacher. I'm not him, And so, but I'm here to talk to the people that resonate with that, So I'm glad you brought that up.
Full alignment. Normally at this point in the podcast, I would ask you for one last piece of advice, but I am going to leave that as a teaser for you guys to have to come back and listen to the next episode. So Ryan, thank you so much for your time. I am very excited to do this again and continue this beautiful conversation with you.
Yes, sir, Adam. I am ready when you are, man. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a blast. So looking forward to the next time we get to dive in together.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for listening to this conversation. Ryan's details will be in the show notes below as always. So if you really resonated with what he had to say, you can find different ways to connect with him, with his highly optimized podcast, as well as this One Time On Psychedelics. So definitely check him out. Give him a follow on Instagram. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening to the Embrace and Expand podcast, and I'll catch you on the next one.